Hey everyone. So this week we're going to dig into consumer behavior for the first time in this course. And so we're going to start off by looking at economic decision making in general, kind of how economists think about human behavior. And then we're going to really focus in on a very formal model of individual consumer behavior, how people decide to purchase what goods and services. And then we're going to wrap up with this long discussion on consumerism, some of its consequences, its relationship to well-being, and finally some policy interventions to kind of maybe help people consume in a more socially efficient way. So let's start off with how economists think about decision-making. The real world is complicated. And any model that an economist builds is going to necessarily have to cut away some elements of human behavior. If we were trying to model human behavior perfectly accurately, we would end up with models that are so complex and convoluted as to be nearly useless. So we make certain simplifying assumptions. Way back in the early days of the discipline, back when it was known as political economy, the norm that people are self-interested and largely rational was introduced, and it kind of became a guiding principle of the discipline. Other motives like altruism were also in there, but subsequently as economics evolved and became more mathematical, it necessarily came to focus more and more on rationality and self-interest, because rationality and self-interest they're far easier to model with mathematical equations because you can essentially use the same mathematics that physicists use. The downside of this is we can end up in a situation where the models that economists use are actually quite far removed from reality and people's experience of actual markets. So, moving on from there, let's just focus right in on the consumer themselves. And so this is how the problem is laid out. Consumers have preferences that they want to satisfy. These preferences are embodied in some mathematical utility function that says if this person gets one hamburger, then they are X happy. So it's essentially telling us how much utility a consumer gets from each good or service that they consume. But consumers face income constraints. They have unlimited wants, at least according to the model, but limited incomes, and they face prices. And so this limits their ability to maximize their utility. So the consumer's problem becomes maximizing their income subject to some budget constraint. Let's start this model of consumer behavior with something called the budget line, or the budget constraint. And so it's defined by two things: a consumer's income and the prices they face. So in this example, let's assume that our consumer is consuming two things. Let's say that there are chocolate bars and packages of nuts. And let's say that the price of chocolate is equal to 1. And the price of nuts, P sub n, is equal to 2. Now let's say our consumer has an income of 8, and we'll call that M. And so what the budget line tells us is what combinations of chocolate bars and nuts our consumer can afford. So, if we draw this graphically, it turns out being conceptually at least a little bit similar to the production possibilities frontier. So let's say that we've got number of chocolate bars on this axis, number of packages of nuts on this axis. So each tick mark here representing 1. And so a really easy way to draw the budget line is to think about it in terms of how many chocolate bars could this person purchase if they spent their entire income on chocolate bars. And so since their income is 8 and the price is 1, they could purchase 8 chocolate bars. And similarly for nuts, if they were to spend their entire income on nuts, they could buy 4 packages of nuts. And if we connect these with a line, what that does is it tells us that anything that lies on the line or in the area A is a bundle of chocolate and nuts that our consumer can afford. An important thing to keep in mind is that the budget line doesn't tell us what bundle of, in this case, chocolate and nuts that the consumer will purchase. It only tells us which goods the consumer can afford to purchase, or which bundles of goods the consumer can afford to purchase. But some things may change, and we can shift this curve around kind of like we do our supply and demand curves. So let's make this a little more abstract. Let's just say this is units of good A and units of good B with our budget line. Now, let's say that the consumer's income rises. And so if M increases, what's going to happen is the consumer can afford more bundles of goods, and so the budget line is going to shift outward. Now, that's pretty intuitive, I think. Now, another thing that could change are the prices of each of the goods. So same as before, good A, good B. And let's start with an initial constraint. And now let us suppose that the price of good A increases. That means that this point on the line is going to move. And which way do you think it's going to move? So it's probably going to shift down, right? Because that represents fewer units of good A. And so since it's more expensive, we can now afford fewer units. But we can still afford the same number of units of B, and so that point doesn't move. If we've got a change in income, the whole curve will shift, either in or out, depending on if it's an increase or a decrease. And similarly, if we've got a change in one of the prices, one of the endpoints of the line is going to move, but the other will remain fixed. The next concept that I'd like to talk about is the utility function. But first we should talk about utility in general. Utility is just the pleasure or satisfaction received from goods, services, or experiences. If we've got a mathematical equation that tells us how much utility a person gains from consuming goods, services, or experiences, that is our utility function. So utility function is a curve showing the relation of utility levels to consumption levels. And so whenever we say utility, you can also kind of think of it as just happiness, right? What people want from consuming goods or services. And now a third and final concept here is the idea of marginal utility. And marginal utility is the change in a consumer's utility when consumption of something changes by 1 unit. Or put another way, the utility gained by consuming 1 additional unit of a good or service. So it'll become important here in just a moment, but marginal utility is one of the ways that we predict the way consumers will make their consumption decisions. One way to represent a utility function is with a table. Alright, so let's call this first column Q, and this is, in this case, we'll just say Q is number of chocolate bars consumed. 6, so just 0 through 6. And then at each of these levels of consumption of chocolate bars, there's some total utility level given to us by the utility function. So let's just assume that at 0 chocolate bars, this person has 0 utility. At 1, they have 10, then 18, 24, 28, 30, and 29. And we can graph this utility function because this is essentially the 2 things we need. So we'll put utility on the vertical axis, and we will put quantity of chocolate bars on the horizontal axis. So this goes out to 6. And then up here we need up to 30, so the first chocolate bar consumed gets us up to 10 utility. When we're consuming 2 chocolate bars, we get to 18. Right about there. Next is 24, 28, 30, 29. And so what we end up with is this nice curve. And we can see that as we move further to the right, we consume more and more chocolate. Each subsequent chocolate bar contributes less and less to total utility, until finally, whenever we're at our 6th chocolate bar, utility actually declines. Now, to get to this idea directly, we can calculate marginal utility. And we can't calculate marginal utility for the 0th unit, but we can calculate it for every subsequent unit. And the way we do that is we just take the total utility value and we subtract from it the value that came before. So here it's 10 minus 0, which is equal to 10. Here it's 18 minus 10 is equal to 8. 24 minus 18 is equal to 6. 28 minus 24 is equal to 4. Going to be 2, and then finally negative 1. And so all of the numbers in this column here tell us how much utility that specific chocolate bar gives the individual. And as they consume more and more chocolate bars, each subsequent chocolate bar contributes less and less. And economists generally assume this phenomenon to be true for all goods and services. And this is the idea of diminishing marginal utility. All that diminishing marginal utility is the tendency for additional units of consumption to add less to utility than did previous units of consumption. We've got this idea of the budget constraint, we've got this idea of the utility function. Let's put these two ideas together to finally, at least in a very simple way, model consumers' consumption behavior. All right, so here I have a table that's kind of putting together a lot of what we've built up to this point. On the first column here, we've got quantity, units consumed. And these first two columns are the total utility of consuming that number of nuts and of chocolate. I've already filled in the chocolate ones that we had previously. And then we also have the marginal utility of each of these goods, as well as this last column, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So let us assume that the total utility from consuming packages of nuts is described like this. So first unit, we get 12. Whenever we consume 2 units, we're at a utility level of 22. 3 units, we're at 30. And then 4 units, we're at 36. And with that information, we can calculate the marginal utility of consuming each unit of nuts. So 12 minus 0, we have 12. 22 minus 12 is 10. 30 minus 22 is 8. And finally, 36 minus 30 is 6. We still don't have everything we need to figure out what bundle of nuts and chocolate this person is going to purchase. To do that, we need to divide each of these marginal utilities of each goods by the prices of those goods to find what's called marginal utility per dollar. For chocolate, we know the price is $1, so the marginal utility values will be just divided by 1, so they won't change. So 10 divided by 1 is 10, 8 divided by 1 is 8, and so on. But to get to the marginal utility per dollar of nuts, we need to divide by 2. So 12 divided by 2 is 6, 10 divided by 2 is 5, 8 divided by 2 is 4, 6 divided by 2 is 3. So now to figure out what bundle this consumer is going to purchase, let's assume that their income is 7, for instance. So they're going to spend their money on whichever good gives them the highest marginal utility per dollar. And we need to track their income as we go. So we'll start with our 7 here. And we can see that the first unit of consumption that gives the highest marginal utility per dollar is chocolate. So they've spent $1 and they're at 6. Next, we are comparing these two cells, the 6 and the 8, and we see that we still get a higher marginal utility per dollar of consuming chocolate. So we're going to purchase that, and we're going to be at 5 income. Now these two are equal, and so it doesn't matter which one we choose, but we've got enough income, so we're going to purchase both. So that puts us at 4, but this one costs $2, so we got to make sure to subtract that as well. And so subtracting $3 total leaves us with $2 left. And now finally we compare the next unit of nuts and the next unit of chocolate, and we can see that the next unit of nuts has a higher marginal utility per dollar. So we're going to purchase that, which depletes our income. So we can say that this consumer is going to purchase 2 units of nuts and 3 units of chocolate. We can also figure out here what this person's total utility will be at this bundle of consumption. Total utility is going to be equal to the total utility of consuming 3 units of chocolate plus the total utility of consuming 2 units of nuts. So that's going to be this 22 plus 24. So 22 plus 24 means that total utility is going to be equal to 46. So this is a very simple version of the way economists model consumer behavior. Now, to be clear here, economists don't generally think that consumers actually do this. They don't think consumers are calculating these things day to day. And as from your own experience, you clearly don't either, and I know I don't. This is just a good approximation of human behavior when people are trying to consume things that they think will make them happy. So it's a good approximation in some market contexts, and we'll move on to discuss some areas where it might be less important or less fitting later in this lecture. Alright, so having walked through that model, let's take a broader view that's not so rooted in this rational consumer behavior. So, consumerism as kind of a cultural staple is relatively new in a historical context. Before capitalism, people largely produced all that they consumed. Shopping wasn't really a thing, or if it was not the center of economic life. And it's always important to remember that individuals act in a bunch of different capacities in an economy. Yes, we are consumers, but we also act as producers, as workers, as householders, and as political citizens. And so we need to keep all of this in mind, that if we only view people as consumers, and that is the only metric of what is good or bad if it increases consumption, then we're kind of setting aside a lot of other very important economic contexts. Consumerism is largely dominant as a cultural force in most capitalist countries today. There are still some customary restrictions on consumerism. I'm sure you could think of some, but an example that I like to think of is limits on hours that shops may be open, or closing shops down on Sunday. And these could be formal in some cities, or they could be customary. And so these are different ways that kind of culture and law kind of push back against consumerist culture. Now, so let's think about what happens when people simply don't have enough to consume all they need. I think we've spoke about poverty previously in this course as a, lack of income, but we can also think of it similarly as a lack of consumption, because that's the aim of it. We don't care that people have money, we care that people have the goods and services they need to survive and lead productive lives. And so there are 2 ways that we can think about this. First is absolute deprivation, and that's just severe deprivation of basic human needs: food, clothing, shelter, these sorts of things. And large swaths of the global population still face purely absolute deprivation. The market fails to remunerate them enough for their labor to allow them to purchase all they need. A kind of stretchier concept is relative deprivation. the feeling of lack that comes from comparing oneself to someone who has more. And so this is largely a cultural phenomenon, right? Like, we look around our society and we say, all right, if I just had X, Y, and Z, then I would have some decent existence, right? There's this idea of the reference group, where people would like to hit this certain level of consumption to reach a certain social status. And there are specific goods that we talk about in this context called Veblen goods. Veblen goods are goods that have this funky shaped demand curve, where demand for them actually increases as their price increases, because they have some status value. Some examples here: luxury cars, jewelry, those sorts of things, right? Flaunting of wealth through purchasing expensive objects. Because part of the value in consuming the good is that it is expensive and others cannot afford it. So this reference group and the kind of reward system of this competitive consumption of Veblen goods is part of culture. But advertising can be thought of as one way in which culture is consciously and deliberately altered to change people's consumption patterns. One possible negative side effect of advertisement is that if advertisement overstates the reference level of consumption in a society, this tends to make people less happy because they're forming higher expectations of social decency than reality may reflect. And there are two ways that you can really view advertising in an economic context. A more charitable view is that it is just information. It is an attempt by producers to inform consumers of the existence of their good so that they can make better purchasing decisions. A more cynical view is that it is deception, that it is essentially trying to convince consumers that purchasing a good and service will make them happier than it will, in fact, in reality, make them. Both are probably somewhat useful or true in different contexts. Just to put this in perspective, though, global advertising budget in 2016 was $520 billion a year. And according to some estimates, Americans are exposed to around 5,000 commercial messages per day of some kind. And this is up from about 2,000 per day in the 1980s. So this is a massive force that changes culture and changes people's expectation of what they ought to consume. Now, changing gears a bit, let's talk about public consumption. So public consumption is something different, right? So like if we are going to a store and we're buying a loaf of bread and then we're eating the loaf of bread, that is private consumption. That is something I purchased that somebody else can't have now that I've purchased it, and I'm consuming it for my own private gain. Public goods are a little bit different. They're non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So things to keep in mind here are like public roads, public parks, things like that. And some of these goods, like parks and roads perhaps, are better provided as public goods than private goods. Could you imagine if you had to pay toll every time you drove to the grocery store, right? Like, it's absurd. But in most capitalist societies, there's a bias towards the provision of private goods and less of an emphasis on consumption and provision of public goods. And we'll dig into this more in later chapters, but there's an idea that people are made more happy overall whenever they consume a good mix of both private and public goods, right? Like, maybe a very stripped down way to think about this is like your own computer and books and, all the things you enjoy in your own home. They make you happy, but also public outdoor space makes you happy, right? And so having a good mix of those makes people happier than having too much of private goods and too much of public goods. So we also need to be considerate of the environmental impacts of consumption. In a very concrete way, we can see this in the things that we consume every day, right? The packaging for a new laptop is waste that has an environmental impact. So does the exhaust from driving a car. And these things are very immediate to the end consumer of a good. But there are also a number of upstream production impacts that are less visible to the consumer, right? So, massive amounts of waste are generated in the production of goods. Now, consumers may make decisions based on the impacts of their consumption, but that's dependent on firms disclosing these upstream impacts, which can be quite substantial. Hundreds of gallons of water for certain agricultural goods, massive piles of physical waste for manufactured goods, these sorts of things. But we shouldn't think of better information as a solution to environmental impacts of consumption. For one, many consumers value low prices over sustainability. And so production that's less sustainable also tends to be cheaper, so they can charge a lower price, right? Consumers' tastes and preferences may not be changeable here, or may take a lot of effort to change. Furthermore, some consumers may be really concerned about this, but kind of similarly, may have an inability to pay. On a global scale, we can think about this very much as people in the West telling people in developing countries, hey, stop building coal-fired power plants, you should use solar and renewables. Whenever they may be failing to meet their most basic economic needs, that's a tough pill to swallow, especially if they're not receiving outside aid. And so there needs to be a broader policy response rather than simply saying that consumers need to buy green goods. Here's a nice kind of way of putting all of this in perspective. Each bar here for each country represents the amount of land that the lifestyles of citizens in that country requires to live their current living standard. We can see here that people in even middle-income countries are consuming far above their equivalent share of global land area. And so it's simply driving home the point that people in the developed world will likely have to suffer a reduction in living standard to meet the goal of environmental sustainability. So let's kind of wrap things up by talking about consumption's relationship to well-being. It's very important to remember that consumption is part of well-being. We do need these goods and services to generate happiness for our citizens. It's very important. But it's not the only measure of well-being. Just like the health of the economy is not purely measured in GDP, the happiness of citizens is not purely measured in their incomes or consumption. So what are some ways that we can measure well-being? Well, other disciplines tend to just ask people. These are called subjective well-being measurements. And essentially it just primes respondents with a bit of introduction and then asks them to rate their well-being on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, something along those lines. And whenever we look at these studies, we again and again see this phenomenon of diminishing marginal utility of income. As people get more and more income, so they can consume more and more, they get happier, but not nearly as much as they did at lower income levels from a grant of equivalent amount of money. So the basic idea here is that somebody that makes $20,000 a year is going to generate a lot more well-being or happiness from getting $5,000 than somebody who's making $100,000 a year. And interestingly, this result holds within countries, but also between countries. So if we kind of aggregate people's happiness level up at a country level, we can see that as per capita income in a country rises, there's an increase in happiness, but it flattens off at a diminishing rate. Taking this more to an individual level, we can think about motivations and how those relate to people's happiness. I won't read this whole quote here, I'll just leave it up for a minute. But it was essentially research that found by some psychologists that people who tended to focus more on money, image, and fame generally reported less happiness, self-actualization, vitality, and all of these other things, and suffered physical and mental symptoms from this hyper-focus on these kind of money, image, and fame variables compared to people who had less materialistic value systems. So I bring this up not to say that the economist's model of consumer behavior is pointless because material things don't make people happy, but simply to highlight the fact that consumption is an important part of well-being that we should examine even in this kind of very stripped down neoclassical, rational, selfish individual framework, but we should not lose sight of everything else that's going on around it. There are a few policies that have been put forward to make people make more socially conscious consumption decisions through this idea of nudging people, right? Instead of saying you can't do X, we make doing X less preferable by making it more costly. One of the first examples is the consumption tax. And so the idea is that you would get rid of income tax and institute a consumption tax. This is seen as a way to get people to consume less and have a greater incentive to save. There are some issues with it, though, in that poorer people tend to consume a greater proportion of their income and save less. And so a consumption tax, in most cases, is actually going to be quite regressive. It's going to tax rich people at a lower rate than poorer people. So many proposals for a consumption tax also include a great deal of exceptions and redistribution to fix that issue. Another example is flexible work hours. We kind of have this focal idea that a full-time job is what you need to get certain benefits, and that is equal to 40 hours a week. No more, no less, certainly. But many people may actually prefer to have more free time, but not part-time levels of free time, right? They may not want to work 20 hours a week. They may want to work 30 or 35. And so if we had more legal protections that made part-time and full-time workers treated more equally in terms of benefits, then we might incentivize people working less, and therefore, by extension, earning less income and consuming less. But they might be happier as a result because they might value free time. And so it's essentially creating a series of policies that would allow people greater choice as workers. And finally, which I think needs the least explanation, would be restrictions on advertising. This is nothing new. We know that certain forms of consumption create large social costs, like smoking, for instance. And so we created a great number of restrictions on the ability of cigarette companies to advertise. And if we think about this in a larger kind of environmental social well-being context, there might be an argument for restricting advertising on other types of goods as well. So, just to recap, we can use this simple model of rational human behavior to predict the actions of consumers, and it's useful in some contexts. But there are large social impacts to consumption that we should keep in mind. Consumption is an important part of happiness, but it doesn't paint this full picture. Individual economic behavior has different motives, and well-being has more things that kind of fold into how happy people are. And finally, we could implement policies to nudge people into making more socially beneficial consumption decisions, but there's likely a lot of political opposition to this in most capitalist countries where consumer culture is so strong. All right, that's all I got for this week. Thanks.